That's okay. It worked perfect. The goal that he reached, as I was reading this passage, uh, it 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 kind of made me wonder. This Paul talks about the race that he ran, and it made me think about life in general. Life. You've heard the saying that life is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And it made me think about that. And I went and looked up the word marathon, and the word marathon actually comes from this historical legend of a Greek messenger named Philippides. I think I said that right. Around the year 490 BC, there was an enormous Persian army that showed up on the plains of a place called Marathon. This looming presence of this great army terrified the city of Athens because they were about 25 miles away. Against all odds, the Athenian army prepared for a brutal battle. They went to the plains in Marathon, and they faced this enemy head on. It was really a battle that would determine the fate of all of their civilization. Somehow, the outnumbered Athenian army, they whooped these Persians. It was an unbelievable victory, down to the last second win. It reminded me of watching a bunch of the playoff games this last football season because so many of those games were won within the last few seconds of the game. That type of a battle or that type of a football game, it keeps the fans right on the edge of their seats. So the story goes that after this battle in Marathon, this runner named Philippides was given this mission to carry this good news of the victory to the terrified residents of Athens. Philippides ran the entire 25 miles across the plain of Marathon to the city of Athens without ever stopping. Not even for a Red Bull or a Gatorade, like we watch the runners today stop for or keep running for. How could he do this? How could he run that far with nothing to sustain him on his run? It's because he was empowered by the good news that he was carrying. When he reached the city limits, he was exhausted. He was dehydrated. He was saturated in what little sweat was left on him. Philippides burst into the city assembly, and with his last breath he shouted, "Rejoice, we have conquered." And then, as the story goes, Philippides collapsed and died. When the poet Robert Browning wrote about this runner many, many years later, he imagined that Philippides died with a smile on his face. Brown believed that the messenger's heart gave out not so much from the exhaustion, but actually from sheer bliss, from this pure euphoria at the victory, from the overwhelming happiness that when he at last reached his destination, and from the ecstatic joy of sharing such good news with the people that he loved. Now the Greek word, I'm going to see if I can say this right, evangelo, that's a Greek word, and that's what the Bible uses for the word gospel or the good news. Really, it was a word that was meant, or we referred to a headline. It's a type of announcement of a great victory or a blessing. And like the good news of the Battle of Marathon, God's victory, won in Jesus Christ, is the kind of news, good news, that sends people running. I'm sure we'll hear more about that on Easter morning. In Philippians, though, Paul imagines his whole life as a kind of a long and an arduous marathon, a mission in which he imagines himself as a runner hitting the wall, straining forward to break the tape at the finish line, trusting that when he gets there, it'll have been worth all the work and all the pain. He says, I forget about all the things behind me and I reach out for the things ahead of me. He said, the goal I pursue is the prize of God's upward call in Jesus Christ. When I hear Paul say reach out in this passage, it gives me, or it leads me to think that maybe he feels that his past is subconsciously holding him back. And he's having to force himself to move forward. It's almost like his past is competing with him for the future. And he's learning to try and let that go. He's continually shedding the things that keep him from his prize. What he did and who he believed he was back then will not remain an obstacle to his pursuit of Christ. This passage reminds me of my old football days of coaching myself. I had this one kid, young kid, his name was Mike. Mike was a machine. He was a tackling machine. To this day, Mike is without a doubt the best defensive end that I ever had the joy of coaching. He had this kind of laser focus between the whistles. Once that ball was hiked, the quarterback had that ball in his hand, Mike never, ever lost focus or lost his sight of that ball. It didn't matter how many guys they sent. If they double-teamed him or if they tried to hide the ball, Mike was focused on that ball. They could try and do a reverse or send out extra blockers to try and take him out. Mike was so locked on the ball every single time. He never even noticed that he would shed a blocker. You could show him the video. He never even remembered how he shed a blocker or how he hurdled over him or how he would just lower his shoulder and run right through him. To Mike, that football was his prize, and that's all that he could see. Mike was as determined as Paul. Only Paul was chasing after Christ. Well, at the time he was writing this letter to the church in Philippi, he was chasing Christ. But Paul reminds himself that he was there was a new mission for him. When we first meet Paul, he was actually running a different race. He was running after Jesus' followers. He was trying to exterminate them. He was a hunter. He was a persecutor. He was on safari to bag Christians and to take them off to jail because of their new religious ideas. During that time in his life, Paul had been running toward a different kind of prize. He wanted to be a success, a religious success. He wanted to be holy. He wanted to be good. He wanted to follow God's law. And he wanted others to follow in the same way that he did. He trained hard. And by Jewish measures, Paul was an extreme success. He listed his spiritual resume in our passage. He was circumcised on the 8th day after his birth, which meant that he was Jewish by birth, not somebody who converted to Judaism. He was born of the tribe of Benjamin, a bloodline it was a good family name. He was a Hebrew, born of Hebrews. He knew how to speak their language. And if they could give him a GPA in following God's law, Paul was he was the Pharisees' class valedictorian. And then, out of nowhere, walking down the road to Damascus, Jesus puts down Paul like my little Mike sacking a quarterback. And while he was down, Paul met and was cared for by one of Jesus' followers. And it was then that Paul came to a new understanding of Christ and his relationship with God's law. Everything he had stood for, everything that he had believed in, wasn't gone, but now it had somehow changed. Paul was on a new mission. Paul realized that he'd been running to deliver the wrong news. This was a new revelation to him. He needed to regroup and he needed to follow this new path. He'd been trained. He'd been conditioned to believe that God's law would lead God, or that God's law would lead people to the prize. And then Jesus comes along and gives him a whole new message to deliver. You see, Paul realized that Christ wasn't an enemy of the law. Christ was the fulfillment of the law, the reason behind the law. The law was the means. Christ was the end. The law had been a wonderful map, but now God had done something even better. He had brought the law to life by sending a faithful guide in Jesus, who embodied in the flesh what the law was all about, and who made it available to all people. Jesus said, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I didn't come to destroy them, but I came to fulfill them." Paul now had a new prize, a new mission that he was running, that he was chasing after, that he was hunting for. He says, "I want to know Christ." He had a new focus and a new way of understanding his life now. He'd been empowered for a whole new mission. Life had become a marathon of the Messiah, not of the old status symbols, or none of those old status symbols mattered anymore. It didn't matter how many committees he had served on, how many service projects he had done, who was his family, how well others respected his work. What mattered now was running after Christ, knowing Christ, and being like Christ. There was a Franciscan monk, and he said, "Once you've come to know the love of Jesus Christ, nothing else in the world will seem as beautiful or as desirable." And this is what Paul discovered, and what we need to remind ourselves as we discover it too. That truly knowing Jesus doesn't rob us of our fun or make us miss out in life, but that it's better than anything we could have ever imagined. Knowing Christ doesn't make us less than who we are. It makes us more than who we are. Friends, we're in week 5 already of our Lenten journey. This is a perfect time for us to think about the mission that we're called to carry out. What message are we running to deliver to others? Are we pressing on? Are we reaching out as hard as we can for what lies ahead of us? I think that's where we are as a church. Let's think about it a minute. 3 years ago, this church called Harmony was just getting started. We had a specific mission then. We needed to figure out who we were. We had to endure some hardships and some losses along the way. Like Paul, we've had to let go of our former identity, remove some of the scales from our eyes that so we could see this new mission, so we could embrace our new selves and reach out for the mission we have, to deliver a message of good news. We're empowered. We are empowered to share the good news of a Savior, willing to die for us so that we could live abundantly for Him and with Him. The race ahead of Paul wasn't an easy one. And the one ahead of us, however hard it might be, is not a grind of guilt or grief, but it's a race of grace. Once Paul focused on his new mission, he was actually free to run. He ran, not because others told him to, but because he wanted to. He follows Jesus, not because he must, but because he may, because he can. Paul runs towards Christ, not because he has to, but because he gets to. The race of grace is not some grim test of willpower or personal worth anymore. It's a joyous jog across the plains of Marathon with good news that fills our soul. This mission work really only works when we're empowered together. So we only have a short time left until Easter to reflect and to listen, to ask yourself, what are you chasing after? Where does your confidence really lie? What's getting you up in the morning and putting you in motion each and every day? Are you running in the right way? Are you running in the right direction? Do you want to know Christ and be like him? So if so, there's good news. Rejoice. The Lord has conquered. Love has won. So run. Run for your life. Run this race because you were born to run this race. Find some running partners. Forget what lies behind you. Reach out to what lies ahead of you. Press on toward the goal. Remember, the goal is to pursue the prize of God's upward calling in Jesus Christ. Run not because you have to, but because Christ has empowered you for a new mission. To God be the glory. Amen.